Welcome, dear dreamer, to the sleeping hourglass. Tonight, as the world outside stills and your own day begins to soften at the edges, we invite you to let go, to unwind, not with silence alone, but with a story, one drawn from the deep well of human imagination, one that has lingered for more than 2,000 years. A tale that never belonged to fact, and yet has shaped hearts and minds as though it were carved in stone. Atlantis. The very name moves like water. It washes against us like a tide that refuses to recede, no matter how many centuries flow by. Born from the voice of a philosopher in ancient Athens, it has drifted across seas and ages, reshaped by scholars, explorers, dreamers, poets, visionaries. Atlantis has never been seen, yet it has never been forgotten. If you find comfort here, in this little harbour of history and dream, you're welcome to subscribe or leave a small sign of support. Not as a duty, but as a way of keeping this quiet space alive, so that whenever you return, the candle will still be burning for you. The story of Atlantis begins not in the surf of some distant ocean, nor in the ruins of a sunken city, but in the quiet, measured voice of a philosopher seated among students in Athens. The city hums beyond the colonnades, its streets alive with merchants, debates, and the clang of the blacksmith's hammer. But here, in the shaded stillness of discourse, a different kind of city takes shape. Not one built of marble or bronze, but of language itself. Plato is our first architect of Atlantis. He does not lay stone upon stone, he lays thought upon thought. In his dialogues, Timaeus and Critias, written in the 4th century BCE, the island arises. It gleams in the imagination as he speaks. Vast, radiant, girdled by concentric rings of sea and land, brimming with wealth, order, and splendour. But even as he builds it in words, he prepares to let it fall, for Atlantis is not simply a marvel, it is a warning, a parable wrapped in grandeur. It begins almost modestly, with a claim that this tale is no invention at all. Plato attributes it to Solon, the great Athenian lawgiver, who, while travelling in Egypt, had heard of it from priests who guarded the records of forgotten times. These priests, Plato tells us, spoke of a mighty power that rose 9,000 years before, beyond the pillars of Heracles, and sought to subdue the lands of the Mediterranean. The armies of Atlantis swept across seas and shores, threatening all. But Athens, young and virtuous, stood alone against them and prevailed. The island, corrupted by its pride and excess, was swallowed by the sea in a single dreadful day and night. What do we hear in this telling? Not only the pulse of an ancient legend, but also the rhythm of Plato's philosophy. For he does not simply recount, he uses the myth as mirror. Atlantis becomes a reflection, a foil against which Athens may measure itself. The island is dazzling in its wealth. Temples plated with orichalcum, ships that cut the waves with ease, rulers who command armies vast and disciplined. Yet all this splendour collapses because the Atlanteans, once noble, fall prey to greed and arrogance. The gods themselves withdraw their favour, and Poseidon, who once gave them their city, now allows the earth and sea to reclaim it. In this, Plato weaves a moral lesson. No city, however strong, is immune to corruption. No empire, however radiant, can stand without virtue at its core. Atlantis is less a geographical claim than an ethical drama, a stage upon which the fate of nations is performed in mythic scale. The dialogue pauses in Timaeus, only to promise more. And in Critias, Plato begins again, offering tantalizing details, the sacred temple to Poseidon, colossal in its proportions, the canals and harbours, alive with commerce, the fertile plain that yielded crops in every season. We can almost walk its streets, feel the grandeur of its courts, hear the laughter of its festivals. Yet the account is left unfinished. The dialogue breaks off mid-breath, as though Atlantis, even in Plato's telling, cannot remain whole. It vanishes, not only in the sea, but in the silence of the text itself. That unfinishedness is part of its power. It leaves us suspended, half believing, half doubting. Did Plato intend us to search for Atlantis on maps or only within ourselves? Was it history remembered or allegory disguised as memory? He never answers. Instead, the city is set adrift, carried forward by the imaginations of those who read him. We must linger here, in this first moment, because it is unlike all the others to come. Every age will reshape Atlantis, but Plato's is the seed, the first spark. His Athens is rising from its wars, reflecting on its triumphs and losses, questioning its place in the world. His dialogues are not idle tales, but instruments of thought, probing what it means to be just, what it means to endure. In that climate, Atlantis becomes more than story. It is an idea dressed as history, a myth wrapped in philosophy. Listen to the cadence of the words. They are not meant to thrill with adventure, but to caution. For even as Plato praises the victory of Athens over the Atlanteans, he holds up a mirror to his own city. Athens, too, knows wealth, empire, and ambition. Athens, too, has stretched its hand across the seas, and Athens, too, has fallen into hubris. It is not hard to hear, beneath the waves of the tale, the echo of Athens' own fate in the Peloponnesian War, when power and pride brought ruin to a city once radiant. And so, Atlantis is both there and here, both then and now. It exists at a distance, across the sea, swallowed by time. But it also hovers close, a parable that whispers of the dangers within one's own gates. Plato speaks of a vanished city, but he means for us to think of our own. How quietly powerful this is, for while countless myths from Greece survive, tales of gods, heroes, monsters, and transformations, few feel so deliberately poised between history and allegory. Few are so carefully set to hover between belief and disbelief. That tension is the secret of Atlantis' endurance. It is never pinned down, never entirely claimed by myth or by fact. It lingers in between, shimmering like a mirage on the horizon of thought. In Plato's telling, the destruction of Atlantis is swift and absolute. A single day and night of earthquakes and floods erase a civilization so vast that even its memory threatens to overwhelm. There is finality in that image, the sea, indifferent, reclaiming all. But there is also an opening. For what is erased invites us to imagine, to fill the silence with our own visions. Plato leaves the city incomplete in his dialogue. The world completes it, again and again, each age according to its longings. We close this first chapter in the awareness that Atlantis begins as philosophy, not archaeology. It is born of discourse, not of stone. Its walls are syllables, its temples are arguments, its harbours are metaphors. Yet even so, how vivid it feels. We sense the salt air around its docks, the gleam of its towers in the sun, the weight of its downfall in the trembling earth. That is the gift of Plato's imagination, to conjure a place both unreal and unforgettable. As we leave Plato's side, the city drifts with us. We know it is not found in his age, nor in the annals of historians that follow him. It slips into silence for centuries, waiting. And yet the idea has been set loose, carried on the currents of memory, until another shore receives it. Plato has given Atlantis its first breath, then let it sink into silence. The dialogue closes, the city dissolves, but the echo remains, a story waiting for another age to remember. And so we drift onward into the long hush that follows him, where myth lies sleeping until it is stirred awake again. The tale of Atlantis, as Plato presents it, does not begin with him, or so he says. He insists that he is not the creator of this legend, but rather the custodian of a memory passed down. It is not Athens that first gave birth to this drowned city, but Egypt. The land of temples, of stone that seems older than time, of priests who guard their records like embers against forgetting. We pause here, in this dim passage of the story, because it speaks of something deeper than Atlantis itself. It speaks of memory, how it is kept, how it is lost, how it is invented. Plato claims that Solon, the wise Athenian lawgiver of the 6th century BCE, travelled to Egypt in search of wisdom, and there in the city of Sais, he was told by priests of a flood, of a war, of a great island beyond the pillars of Heracles. Solon listened, astonished, for the priests told him that the Greeks were but children when it came to memory. Their records were too fragile, their recollections too easily washed away by catastrophe. Egypt, they said, had endured, and Egypt remembered. This is the first transformation of Atlantis. The passing of story from one culture to another, a relay across civilizations. The Greeks, restless and questioning, reach back into Egypt, whose monuments rose like eternal guardians of time. The priests of Sais become the voices through which Atlantis enters Greek imagination, clothed in the dignity of antiquity, as though older than Greece itself. But is this true memory, or is it invention disguised as memory? Plato offers no proof, only authority. By invoking Egypt, he gives weight to his tale. Egypt, to the Greek mind, was the custodian of hidden knowledge, a land that seemed untouched by the same fragility that plagued Greece with its cycles of war and destruction. Egypt carried the aura of permanence, and so to root Atlantis there was to make it both older and grander. It is worth lingering on this choice. Myths rarely survive because they are told once. They survive because they travel. They cross borders, take on new languages, slip into new forms. Like rivers, they carry fragments of one land into another. Flood myths had long flowed through Mesopotamia, Egypt, and Greece. Stories of worlds washed away, of civilizations undone by water, echoed from the tablets of Gilgamesh to the scrolls of Egyptian priests. When Plato situates Atlantis as an Egyptian tale, he is tapping into this wider current. The sense that the sea itself remembers, that waters are keepers of forgotten ages. And yet, the irony is clear, what is remembered is often what is invented. Solon never wrote of Atlantis. Egyptian inscriptions hold no mention of a mighty island empire lost to the waves. The priests' voices are only heard through Plato, and Plato, in turn, may be shaping them to his philosophical design. Atlantis, in this way, is not so much a memory as a memory of memory, a tale that wears the mask of history while living in the realm of imagination. Still, there is beauty in the gesture. Memory, whether true or invented, serves a purpose. Plato's Atlantis is not meant to be a dry record, it is meant to be a mirror. By tying it to Egypt, he shows how stories extend beyond one culture, how wisdom is claimed not by ownership but by inheritance. What matters is not where the story began, but how it is carried forward. Consider the Egyptians themselves. Their temples were filled with inscriptions. their tombs painted with scenes meant to preserve identity beyond death. Memory was survival, and writing was the vessel. To them, forgetting was a second death, more final than the first. To attribute Atlantis to Egyptian priests is to weave the myth into this sacred art of remembering. To suggest that it was written, preserved, waiting for the moment when Greece would be ready to hear. And perhaps that is why Plato frames it so. For the Greeks had their own cycles of forgetting. Fires had destroyed libraries, wars had silenced poets, floods had swept away fragile records. Egypt, untouched in Plato's eyes, offered a stable ground. To root Atlantis, there was to claim a memory immune to loss. It is no coincidence that the myth itself is about loss. A city swallowed, a world undone. The tale is memory speaking of its own fragility. There is another layer to consider, the idea of cultural memory itself. Myths are not simply old stories, they are ways of holding on to meaning when facts slip away. They are vessels of truth too large for mere chronology. Floods may have happened, empires may have risen and fallen, but in the telling they become lessons, warnings, hopes. Atlantis, preserved through Egypt in Plato's story, becomes a myth about the endurance of memory itself, about how even in destruction a story can survive, if only in whispers. We might imagine Solon in Egypt, standing beneath colossal columns, listening to priests recite tales older than his homeland. We picture the Nile flowing past, calm and eternal, as though mocking the fragility of Greek memory. The story he carries back, whether real or imagined, is transformed in Plato's hands into a dialogue that continues to ripple through centuries. Even if Atlantis never was, the invention of its memory has given it life. This, perhaps, is the paradox of myth, that its strength does not come from proof, but from persistence. Atlantis may never have stood upon the earth, yet it stands within human thought, because Plato said it was remembered. That claim of memory, that the tale was not his invention but Egypt's inheritance, has allowed Atlantis to drift across time, as though it truly had a past. Memory, here, is less about what was and more about what is believed. As we linger on this, we see that Plato's gesture is not merely historical, it is poetic. He places Atlantis in a chain of remembering, a chain that links Greece to Egypt, myth to history, imagination to permanence. In this way, he makes the myth larger than himself. It is not his alone, he insists. It belongs to humanity's long memory. And in that move, the city beneath the waves gains a kind of immortality. We close this chapter with the recognition that memory is not always about accuracy. Sometimes it is about resonance, about the stories we choose to carry, because they tell us something about who we are. Atlantis survives not because it was remembered faithfully, but because it was remembered at all. It has become the echo of an echo, and yet still it speaks. And so Atlantis, born of Plato's pen, wears the cloak of Egypt's memory, drifting across cultures like a tide that carries fragments of many shores. But memory alone cannot hold it. Silence will soon fall. And for centuries, the story will rest in shadows, waiting to be awakened once more. When Plato gives us Atlantis, he gives it not as a dream to escape into, but as a mirror to look into. At first glance, the island seems like a wonder, vast harbours alive with ships, temples glistening in the sun, gardens watered by ingenious canals, a civilization so ordered and prosperous that it seems to rival the gods themselves. Yet beneath the shimmer lies a shadow, for in Plato's telling, Atlantis is not meant to dazzle for its own sake. It is meant to warn. Athens in Plato's time has already tasted both glory and ruin. The city has known triumph at Salamis when its ships, swift and daring, drove back the mighty Persian fleet. But it has also known exhaustion and humiliation in the Peloponnesian War, when its empire stretched too far, when its hunger for dominance consumed it from within. Plato himself lived in the wake of that war. He saw the arrogance of Athens lead to defeat. He saw the democracy stumble, falter, even betray itself. He saw how quickly power turns to hubris and hubris to ruin. It is against this background that Atlantis rises as allegory. The island is painted as a utopia, but one that decays. Once noble, once guided by divine gifts, its rulers begin to hunger for conquest. Their eyes no longer rest content on their own abundance. They wander toward foreign lands, toward dominion, toward empire. In this turning outward, they lose the inward harmony that once sustained them. Their city remains rich in appearance, but poor in soul. The gods withdraw their favor. What is left is splendor without virtue, and splendor without virtue cannot stand. Plato sets Athens against this shadow. In the myth, it is Athens, young and virtuous, that resists the Atlantean tide. Though smaller, though seemingly weaker, Athens fights with justice on its side and triumphs. Atlantis falls, drowned in a single night of earthquakes and floods, while Athens endures as a beacon of courage. But this victory is bittersweet, for Plato is not simply praising Athens, he is warning it. The Atlantis story is less about a vanished island than about the dangers that come when a city forgets its measure. In its greed, Atlantis mirrors the very tendencies Plato fears in his own homeland. His story asks what keeps a society alive. Wealth, armies, and ships may dazzle, but without wisdom, without restraint, without justice, they become weights that drag the city downward into the sea. Philosophers often use myths not as entertainment, but as moral maps. The tale of Atlantis is one such map. It charts the dangers of unchecked ambition. It marks the reefs where pride wrecks empires. It draws the contour of a utopia turned dystopia, a place that seems perfect, but whose perfection is a trap. By imagining the fall of Atlantis, Plato warns against the future fall of Athens. And here, the story deepens into something timeless. For the lesson is not only for Athens, not only for Plato's students sitting in the shaded grove. It is for every city, every age. Power dazzles, abundance intoxicates. Knowledge without humility blinds. A society that begins with wisdom but ends with arrogance will find itself swallowed by its own excess. The myth becomes a parable for humanity itself, for the cycles by which civilizations rise, peak, and collapse. Let us pause and walk through Atlantis once more, as Plato describes it. We see its concentric circles of land and sea, each ring joined by bridges, each canal brimming with ships. We see temples to Poseidon, their walls flashing with the strange metal orichalcum, now lost to us, but in his telling as common there as bronze. We see elephants roaming its plains, fountains of hot and cold water springing from the earth, and a people who once honored the gods with moderation and balance. It is a paradise of ingenuity and beauty, a city designed with harmony at its heart. And yet, it is not harmony that endures. It is hunger, slowly, almost imperceptibly. The Atlanteans tilt toward conquest. Their leaders, descendants of gods, forget their divine share. Human desire outweighs divine measure. The island turns outward, seeking to subdue neighbors, to rule the Mediterranean, to stretch its empire as far as ambition will carry it. and in this moment of grasping, the ground beneath it begins to tremble. This is the heart of Plato's warning. Utopia, without humility, becomes its own undoing. A society that achieves abundance but loses balance will find that abundance transformed into burden. Just as a tree heavy with fruit may break its own branches, a city laden with riches may snap beneath the weight of its desires. The more Atlantis seeks to expand, the more it hastens its own destruction. To the listener in Athens, this was not a distant fable but an intimate echo. They knew of empires overreaching. Persia, vast and glittering, brought to ruin on the plains of Marathon and the straits of Salamis. They knew of their own empire, built upon tribute and fleets, brought to collapse when arrogance outpaced prudence. Atlantis was not a place across the sea. It was a reflection in the water, showing Athens its own shadow. Plato, ever the teacher, embeds the lesson quietly. He does not preach directly against Athens. He paints a city elsewhere, far enough to seem detached, close enough to strike home. He sets up a utopia, then allows it to rot, showing how even the finest order crumbles when virtue is lost. His students, hearing the dialogue, would not only marvel at the image of a drowned island, they would feel the caution beneath the waves. And so, the myth becomes more than myth. It becomes pedagogy, a way to speak truths that might be too sharp if said plainly. For what city welcomes a voice that says, "You are corrupt, you will fall"? But what city cannot help but ponder when told, "There was once an island, radiant and mighty, undone by its own pride"? The parable softens the blow even as it sharpens the lesson. This is the paradox of Atlantis as Plato gives it, a utopia and a warning, a place that never was yet always is. It reminds us that stories are not always about the past, nor always about the literal. They are ways of thinking, ways of seeing, ways of measuring our own world against an imagined one. Atlantis, in this sense, is not lost. It is teaching. As we let the story settle, we feel its weight. The sea closes over the island, but the lesson remains afloat. Civilizations may rise and fall, but the question endures. Will we learn from their shadows or repeat their descent? Plato leaves the answer to us, drifting in the silence after his dialogue ends. Atlantis sinks, but its warning rises, a mirror held to Athens, to all cities, to all times. Yet after Plato's telling, the story does not march onward. It falls quiet, almost forgotten, as if the sea itself lulls it into sleep. And so we follow it into that long silence, where the myth slumbers until another age recalls its name. Plato, with his pen and voice, sends it echoing through the chambers of thought. A mighty island empire, a moral warning, a civilization swallowed by the sea. It is a tale destined, one might think, to reverberate endlessly through the minds of philosophers and poets. And yet, after his voice there is a pause. For centuries the tale lies almost untouched. The silence is not accidental but deliberate. Plato's contemporaries, his successors, those who carried the flame of Greek philosophy, do not repeat the story. Aristotle, who once listened to Plato's words as a young student, dismisses Atlantis with the shrug of reason. The man who invented it, he is said to have remarked, destroyed it. For him, the tale is nothing more than a crafted parable, a vessel for teaching, not a memory of truth. And with this dismissal, the myth is placed gently on a shelf, left to gather dust. The silence stretches across centuries. Historians like Herodotus, Thucydides, and Polybius never speak its name. Roman writers, too, seem unconcerned, They borrow eagerly from Greece, its gods, its heroes, its philosophies, but not this story. In their libraries and amphitheatres, where tales of Troy and Hercules endure, Atlantis is absent. The scrolls remain unrolled, the ink unstirred. Why? Perhaps because the story carried too much of Plato's voice, too much of his moral scaffolding. To repeat Atlantis was to repeat Plato himself, and in that age, originality was prized. To speak of it would not be to tell a legend, but to echo a philosopher's classroom. And so, the world turns its ear away, but silence has its own power. Myths, like seeds, do not vanish when buried. They wait, pressed into the soil of human thought, patient. Atlantis slumbers in the quiet centuries, unspoken yet not forgotten. The Mediterranean world changes, empires rise and fall, temples crumble, and the Christian faith spreads across lands once ruled by marble gods. Still, the story does not reappear. It rests, like a dream too fragile for daylight. There is something haunting in this absence. For we know that myths live not only through retelling, but also through silence. A myth unspoken gathers an aura, a sense of mystery. It becomes a shadow lingering at the edges of imagination. One can almost hear it breathing beneath the centuries. Not gone, but waiting. This silence is also a reminder of the fragility of memory. How many stories told by firelight or carved into stone have been lost forever? Whole civilizations spoke myths we will never know. The silence after Plato shows us how easily a tale might have disappeared. Atlantis could have been erased by time, reduced to a single line in a forgotten dialogue. It is only by chance, by the survival of Plato's manuscripts through wars, fires, and the slow erosion of parchment, that we can still hear it at all. To drift through these silent centuries is to imagine a library where the scroll lies unopened. Picture a scholar in Alexandria, passing it over for Homer or Hesiod. Imagine a Roman senator preferring Virgil's lines to Plato's dialogues. Each time Atlantis slips further into shadow, it becomes a myth that is not told, a story asleep. And yet, in its sleep, it gathers strength. Myths do not wither when ignored, they ferment, waiting for new listeners, for a new world that might hear them differently. The silence after Plato is not death, but gestation. Atlantis is becoming more than Plato's invention. It is becoming a riddle, a ghost of memory that future ages will awaken with fresh wonder. When the medieval world arrives, the silence continues. Europe turns its eyes to scripture, to saints and miracles. The old Greek voices are preserved in monasteries, copied by candlelight, yet few open the page where Atlantis waits. The silence deepens, like a winter around a seed. It is tempting to think of myths as eternal flames, always burning, always told. But Atlantis shows us another truth, that stories, like stars, can disappear from sight. They may not die, but they drift below the horizon, hidden by clouds, waiting for a future dawn. The silence after Plato is that horizon, a long night through which the myth must travel, and in that silence Atlantis becomes something more mysterious. By not being told, it is made strange, exotic, a treasure rediscovered rather than an inheritance passed hand to hand. The centuries of forgetfulness will one day give it power. When it is remembered, it will not return as a mere teaching story, but as a lost world. A tale resurrected from obscurity, carrying the weight of absence with it. For now, though, we drift with the silence. We imagine the unspoken myth lying beneath layers of dust and neglect, waiting for voices that will one day awaken it. Plato's pen has written it into history, but history itself seems to hold its breath. Atlantis sleeps, as myths sometimes must, to be born again in another age. And so we linger in the silence after Plato, where Atlantis rests in shadow, neither alive nor gone, waiting for new ears, a new century, to awaken it. Soon, voices will return to the story, and the myth will stir again. The Renaissance is a time of lanterns being lit after centuries of shadow. In the candlelit rooms of Florence, Venice, and Seville, words once lost to dust are pressed again into ink. The ancient voices, Plato among them, return to the living. It is as though the world, long asleep beneath a heavy curtain of silence, suddenly inhales, remembers, and begins to dream once more. Among the many recovered treasures, the tale of Atlantis stirs. For 1,000 years, its echo had been faint, buried in the folds of Plato's Timaeus and Critias. Few had spoken of it, fewer still had dwelt upon it. But in this new age, an age where curiosity itself feels like a form of worship, the myth finds new listeners. The 15th century is restless. Its eyes look backward toward the wisdom of Greece and Rome, and forward toward seas untravelled, maps unfinished, horizons unclaimed. The rediscovery of ancient texts becomes more than scholarship, it is a hunger, a calling. And so, when the name of Atlantis is once again whispered, it finds fertile ground in minds already prepared to imagine worlds beyond the known. In Italy, scholars pore over manuscripts newly carried west from Byzantium, rescued from the crumbling libraries of Constantinople after its fall. Greek words are translated, pressed onto paper, and scattered like seeds into Europe's soil. The printing press, itself a miracle of the age, carries these words farther than any scribe's hand could have dreamed. For the first time, Plato's dialogues are not the guarded treasure of a few monks or scholars, but a conversation anyone who can read may enter. And what a conversation it is! Plato's story of Atlantis does not read like a myth of gods and monsters. Instead, it presents itself as memory, as history, as something told and retold until its truth and its invention are entwined. To Renaissance thinkers, already accustomed to reading the ancients as guides to both morality and nature, this tale feels like more than allegory. It feels like possibility. If the Greeks wrote of a vanished island, could it not be real? If civilizations had risen and fallen before, might there not be lessons, or even treasures, still hidden in the sea's embrace? Maps become vessels of longing. Cartographers sketch coastlines with care, yet the edges of their parchments remain open to dream. In the blank spaces of the Atlantic, between the Azores and the Canaries, between Portugal and horizons unnamed, there is room for a lost world to dwell. Some mark phantom islands, some leave hints. An archipelago sketched faintly. A note in the margin, perhaps this was Atlantis. Explorers take such whispers seriously. The ocean is wide, and who can say what lies beyond? To step into a ship is to gamble with mystery, to court the possibility of discovery. And so, as men like Prince Henry of Portugal send ships down the African coast, as Genoese merchants dream of routes westward, Atlantis sails invisibly alongside them. The idea itself is a compass pointing not north or south, but inward, toward wonder. The Renaissance is not only a time of voyages in the sea, but voyages of the mind. Humanists read Plato not merely to imitate, but to surpass. They see in the ancients both warning and inspiration. And when they encounter Atlantis, they see more than ruin, they see blueprint. Could such a civilization, wise and strong, be reborn? Could the order of a city be arranged so perfectly that it would endure where Atlantis did not? These questions settle like candle smoke in the air of academies and courts. At the same time, merchants and rulers, driven by both faith and gold, look outward. New lands are being spoken of, islands in the ocean, strange coasts glimpsed by sailors pushed off course by storm. The boundaries of the world are expanding, and in that expansion, the old myths gain new urgency. Atlantis is no longer a parable whispered by philosophers. It might be a land waiting to be claimed. Yet the beauty of the myth is that it resists capture. Every age remakes Atlantis in its own image. In the Renaissance, it is coloured by curiosity and hunger, by the twin lights of knowledge and conquest. It becomes both a scholar's question and an explorer's prize. The Lost Island mirrors the Renaissance itself, reaching backward for wisdom, forward for discovery, and always beyond what is certain. Imagine, then, a scholar in Florence, leafing through a newly printed copy of Plato, the ink still sharp and black. He pauses at the passage that speaks of a great city, vast and radiant, brought low by hubris and divine wrath. The scholar lifts his eyes, hearing in the silence of his study the roar of waves, the crumble of towers, the whisper of a city slipping beneath the sea. In that moment, Atlantis is not allegory, it is alive. And elsewhere, in a port city, an explorer listens to tales of islands glimpsed far west of the Azores. He spreads out a map and, in the unmarked space of ocean, wonders if a paradise lies hidden. Atlantis is not myth here. It is destination. The 15th century is a hinge of history, and Atlantis swings open with it. The myth, long dormant, takes its place alongside compass and sextant, alongside scripture and scroll. It becomes part of the Renaissance imagination, shimmering between what is sought and what is dreamed. We must remember, though, that the Renaissance does not only awaken the myth, it reshapes it. The printing press multiplies it. Maps give it form, voyages give it momentum, and all the while the hunger for lost wisdom fuels it. Atlantis becomes a mirror of the age curious, ambitious, hopeful, and restless. It is easy to see why. The Renaissance is itself a kind of rediscovery of learning, of art, of possibility. To find Atlantis in Plato's words is to find an emblem of the ager world, once glorious, forgotten, and now remembered. A world that beckons, reminding humanity of both greatness and fragility. The myth stretches its new wings. It hovers not in obscurity, but in every scholar's study, every cartographer's map, every sailor's dream. Atlantis is awake once more, carried forward by the tide of discovery that defines the 15th century. And yet, as with all myths, it slips away even as it is grasped. For every map that sketches its shores, the ocean erases them. For every scholar who claims to know its truth, others doubt. Atlantis remains, as ever, suspended between presence and absence, promise and loss. The Renaissance does not solve the riddle of Atlantis. It makes the riddle larger. And so, in the Renaissance, Atlantis rises again, not as ruins beneath the waves, but as longing in the human spirit, pressing outward towards seas uncharted. Soon, those seas will open, and whispers of Atlantis will follow sails across the western horizon, toward the new world. The sea has always been more than water. It is silence and memory, horizon and promise. For the sailors of the 15th century, it is also danger, a rolling, endless presence that both feeds and consumes. When the age of discovery begins, the ocean is not only a path, it is a question. And somewhere beneath its waves, or perhaps beyond them, the myth of Atlantis stirs again. In 1492, Christopher Columbus sails westward. His ships, the Nina, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria, cut into waters that had long been spoken of with hesitation. To the sailors, the Atlantic is wide, uncertain, almost infinite. It is not just geography, it is imagination. And as they sail, the winds carrying them into silence, whispers arise. Could the lands they seek be Plato's island reborn? Columbus himself reads the ancient texts. He knows Plato, knows the story of a civilization drowned in divine anger. And though he sails in search of India, the possibilities glimmer in his mind. In his journals, he writes of islands glimpsed, of coasts kissed by sunlight, of worlds forgotten to Europe but alive in rumour. The word Atlantis does not appear often in his hand, yet its shadow hovers behind his wonder. When the new world appears, green shores, new peoples, rivers broad and shining, many in Europe cannot help but ask, is this Atlantis found? For 1,000 years, the tale has been folded away like a manuscript hidden on a dusty shelf. But now, with the sudden revelation of continents unknown, the old myth breathes new air. Perhaps Plato's story was not allegory after all. Perhaps he remembered a truth carried across generations, and now that truth rises once more on the horizon. The ocean becomes both mirror and mystery. Sailors glimpse coasts that seem both ancient and new, as if they have stepped into a memory long submerged. They write home of golden cities, of people clothed in feathers and bright colours, of temples rising like forgotten palaces. The imagination of Europe rushes to fill these accounts with echoes of Plato. If Atlantis was a city of power, glory, and ruin, could not these newly found lands hold the same fate? Explorers carry more than compasses and swords. They carry dreams. When they look at the great rivers of the Americas, the Orinoco, the Amazon, they imagine them as the channels described in Plato's dialogue, circling the heart of Atlantis. When they hear of cities of gold like El Dorado, they see in them the shimmer of lost palaces beneath the sea. The myth adapts, reshapes itself like water taking the shape of every vessel. For some, the new world is paradise regained. For others, it is a land waiting to be judged, a second Atlantis destined to fall. Missionaries warn that pride and idolatry could summon the same wrath that drowned the island once before. Conquerors, meanwhile, wield the myth as justification. If the ancients fell to ruin, then these lands too must be conquered, ordered, reshaped. Atlantis becomes a story not just of wonder, but of conquest. Yet beyond politics and plunder, there is awe. Imagine a sailor stepping onto sand that no European foot has touched in memory. He looks inland and sees forests vast as oceans themselves, mountains crowned in snow, rivers glimmering like molten glass. In the silence of that sight, he might recall the philosopher's words of a land larger than Libya and Asia, of marvels sunk but perhaps not lost. Atlantis leaves not in proof, and in resonance, and here the resonance is strong. The 16th century swells with speculation. Scholars debate whether the Americas are remnants of the lost island. Some point to the ruins of native civilizations, temples and cities carved with stone and story. They imagine these as fragments of a greater whole, survivors of a flood Plato once described. Others see the indigenous peoples themselves as descendants of Atlanteans, scattered when the sea rose to swallow their home. The idea seeps into maps. Cartographers sketch the coasts of the New World, but in their margins Atlantis lingers. The Azores, The Canaries and newly found Caribbean isles all become candidates, each suggested as the last fragments of a drowned world. The sea, vast and inscrutable, hides its truths well, and in that hiding, the myth thrives. But the ocean does more than conceal. It also reflects. The Renaissance mind, gazing west, sees not only strange lands but its own longing. Atlantis is not simply a place they hope to find. It is a mirror of desire, of the hunger for discovery, wealth, and meaning. The New World is not Atlantis in truth, but in spirit a reminder that humanity is always seeking what has been lost, always imagining that somewhere across the next horizon lies a golden shore. And so, Atlantis becomes tied to the Americas. Travelers and chroniclers weave it into their accounts. The lost island, once the concern of philosophers, is now whispered in taverns, written in letters, drawn into the hearts of maps. A myth thousands of years old is reborn in the wake of sails and storms. Yet the sea, in its vast patience, keeps its silence. No ruined walls rise from its depths, no marble columns stand against the tide. Atlantis remains unproven, as elusive as ever, and still the myth endures. It is not defeated by absence, it is strengthened by it. For in every unknown coast, every river that vanishes into the jungle, every city swallowed by time, there is room to wonder. The explorers may claim gold, land, and empire, but the ocean holds something richer: mystery. In that mystery, Atlantis survives. And so the 16th century carries the myth westward, fastening it to the Americas. It becomes a companion to every voyage, a shadow across every map. The ocean is no longer only a space between, it is a canvas upon which old dreams are painted anew. The New World, for those who arrive, is not Atlantis. It is something greater, more complex, more real. Yet in the quiet hours, when sailors lean on railings and stare into dark waters, when scholars pore over Plato and gaze at new maps, the thought lingers. Perhaps Atlantis has been found. Perhaps it lies here, waiting to be seen. The tide rolls on. Atlantis, never captured, never proved, survives because it cannot be claimed. In the wake of Columbus and those who follow him, the myth does not fade. It grows, shimmering between fact and imagination, as eternal as the sea itself. And so, across the wide Atlantic, the myth travels with the ships of discovery, reshaping itself in every wave. Soon, it will not only belong to sailors and scholars, but to philosophers once more, for in the 17th century, a new vision will rise. Francis Bacon's New Atlantis. The 17th century opens with a different kind of voyage. No sails are raised, no anchors drawn. Instead, minds unfurl themselves into uncharted seas, seeking not continents, but knowledge itself. The Renaissance has stirred wonder in the human spirit, the Reformation has unsettled certainty, and now the age of reason begins to cast its light across Europe. In this shifting tide, the story of Atlantis takes on a new form, less as memory of a drowned world, and more as blueprint for a world yet to be built. In 1627, the English philosopher Francis Bacon publishes a strange, unfinished work, New Atlantis. Unlike Plato's dialogues, it does not tell of hubris punished or of cities drowned. It does not tremble with divine anger. Instead, it breathes with hope. It paints the image of an island not lost to the sea, but risen from imagination. A place where knowledge, order, and invention flourish in harmony. Bacon's island is Bensalem, a name carrying both resonance and calm. It is a land of order, where learning is not scattered, but gathered into an institution of remarkable scope, the House of Salomon. Here, Men study the natural world with devotion, unlocking its secrets not for vanity, but for the good of all. Machines hum. Experiments are tended, knowledge is preserved and shared. If Plato's Atlantis warned against excess, Bacon's Atlantis dreams of perfect balance. This shift is more than literary. It is cultural. Europe stands at the threshold of modern science. Telescopes have begun to peer into the stars. Microscopes are revealing hidden worlds beneath a drop of water. The old cosmos, geocentric, enclosed, ordained, is breaking open. And as it opens, Bacon offers a vision, a society devoted to harnessing this expanding knowledge, guided not by superstition or greed, but by reason. Imagine, then, a reader in 1627, unfolding the pages of New Atlantis by candlelight. Outside, the world is unsettled. Empires contend across oceans. Religious conflict divides nations. The future feels uncertain, fractured, trembling. But within these pages lies a different image, a serene island where learning is revered, where wisdom orders society, where discovery is not chaos but clarity. To such a reader, Bensalem must feel like a lantern carried into the storm. Bacon himself, in his greater works, is often called the father of empiricism. He insists that knowledge should not be built on mere speculation or inherited tradition, but on observation, experiment, and proof. In his philosophy, he urges humanity to collect data, to draw from nature itself the truths that can transform life. In New Atlantis, he gives this philosophy a body, a setting, a pulse. He creates not only an idea, but a world where that idea breathes. And in doing so, he reshapes Atlantis. No longer is it a sunken warning hidden beneath waves. It becomes a forward-looking vision, a model of what might be. It bends toward modernity, carrying with it the quiet hope that humanity might avoid the ruin of the past by choosing wisdom in the present. The story itself is simple. A European ship, lost upon the ocean, drifts to an unknown island. There, the sailors encounter Bensalem, a land orderly, generous, and radiant with knowledge. They are given hospitality, guided by hosts who reveal to them glimpses of the island's wonders. It is less narrative than meditation, an unfolding of ideals through setting. And though Bacon never completed the tale, the fragment that survives is enough. It whispers of a possible world, a better world, one that stands in contrast to the turbulence of 17th century Europe. In Bensalem, there are no wars of religion tearing at the soul. There is no endless hunger for gold or conquest. Instead, there is reverence for the pursuit of truth. The island becomes an allegory, not for what has been lost, but for what might yet be gained. If Plato's Atlantis mirrored the anxieties of ancient Athens, Bacon's Atlantis mirrors the longings of modern Europe. It reflects the hope that knowledge might guide rather than corrupt, that order might soothe rather than oppress, that discovery might heal rather than wound. In this, it is both a utopia and a prayer. The House of Salomon, that great centre of learning, seems, in retrospect, prophetic. Within its halls, Bacon imagines laboratories, observatories, collections of specimens, experiments in agriculture and medicine. He foresees inventions that would not exist for centuries: submarines, flying machines, engines. It is as though he has placed the seeds of modern science within the soil of myth. In the centuries to come, scientific academies will rise across Europe, the Royal Society in England, the Académie des Sciences in France. In them, Bacon's vision will find echoes. The dream of Bensalem will quietly shape the world, and so Atlantis changes its form. It is no longer a memory of what drowned, but a dream of what might rise. The island is not hidden beneath the waves, but shining in the horizon of imagination. This is the gift of myth. It is never still. It bends with the age. It reflects the longing of the time. Where once Atlantis warned of pride, it now promises wisdom. Where once it spoke of loss, it now speaks of possibility. Yet even this vision carries shadows. Bacon's world is not only serene, it is controlled. The knowledge in Ben Salam is carefully guarded, measured, dispensed. It is a society of order, yes, but also of hierarchy. As much as it glimmers with hope, it carries the weight of authority. Every utopia carries within it the question, whose dream is this, and who must live within it? Still, the power of Bacon's New Atlantis lies not in its perfection, but in its invitation. It does not tell the reader what the future must be. It shows what it could be, if wisdom were cherished, if knowledge were honored, if discovery were devoted to the common good. In this, the myth of Atlantis is reborn as a mirror of humanity's better self, a reminder that, even in storm and fracture, we are capable of dreaming order into being, and perhaps that is why the fragment endures. Though unfinished, though brief, it carries the resonance of longing. Like Atlantis itself, it remains incomplete, half-seen, shimmering on the horizon of thought. In Bacon's hands, the island that once drowned in Plato's sea rises again, not in ruins, but in vision. The myth bends toward modernity, toward science, toward reason. It is a lighthouse in the fog of an uncertain century, calling the restless ship of humanity toward a shore it has not yet reached. And so, Bacon's New Atlantis does not sink beneath the waves, but hovers ahead like a star, guiding thought into a new age. Yet as centuries turn, the light of reason will mingle with longing once more. And in the Enlightenment, Atlantis will become less a place than an idea, drifting between dream and debate. The 18th century opens like a window. The world inhales the air of reason, and the light of new questions spills across Europe. Coffee houses hum with voices. Printing presses release rivers of ink. A spirit of inquiry rises, restless and unafraid, touching science, politics, and the very structure of human thought. It is the age we call the Enlightenment, and it is in this light that Atlantis too takes on a new, shimmering shape. No longer is the lost island only a cautionary tale whispered from Plato's dialogues. No longer is it merely the dream of explorers charting unknown seas. Now, it becomes something different, an intellectual instrument, a stage on which philosophers can imagine what human beings might be if freed from the chains of ignorance and tyranny. In this century of thought, Atlantis becomes less geography, more philosophy. Jean-Jacques Rousseau, with his yearning for origins, looks back to a world before corruption, before society bent the soul. His writings tremble with nostalgia for a simpler humanity, natural, unspoiled, alive with innocence. Atlantis, though he does not claim it outright, resonates with this longings, a paradise lost, a civilization untouched, undone by pride yet still radiant in memory. In Rousseau's vision of the noble savage, there is a faint Atlantean echo, as though across centuries, Plato's drowned city still whispers of what mankind once was and what it might yet recover. Voltaire, sharper in wit, more skeptical in tone, regards Atlantis differently. To him, it is not a dream to restore, but a myth to interrogate. In his satires and essays, he questions the ease with which men invent golden ages, clinging to illusions while overlooking the labor of the present. For Voltaire, Atlantis is a mirror, reflecting not a real land, but the hunger of human minds to believe that perfection lies elsewhere, always in a vanished past or a distant horizon. His pen, dipped in irony, reminds his readers, beware of utopias, for they often conceal folly. And yet, the 18th century is not merely skeptical, it is also wildly hopeful. As science maps the heavens and catalogues the earth, thinkers begin to believe in progress. Not merely survival, but improvement, the deliberate shaping of human destiny. Here, Atlantis finds a new use not as memory, nor as warning, but as blueprint. Philosophers and dreamers imagine societies ordered by reason, guided by justice, lifted by knowledge. The lost island, once destroyed by hubris, is now rewritten as a foundation for possibility. In salons lit by candlelight, where powdered wigs nod over glasses of wine, discussions swirl about natural rights, liberty, and the common good. In those conversations, Atlantis hovers like a ghostly participant, an example of what might be built or lost. When societies dare to reach too far, maps of utopia are sketched not only in philosophical texts, but in novels, in plays, in whispered debates that stretch deep into the night. The myth bends itself to these longings. Some writers imagine Atlantis as a society of perfect equality, where wisdom governs and injustice has no soil in which to root. Others dream of it as a scientific paradise, its people mastering arts and technologies that Europe itself is only beginning to grasp. Still others invoke it as a symbol of ruin, warning that even the most radiant civilization can vanish in a single surge of fate. It is striking how pliable the island becomes in these hands. To Rousseau, it is innocence. To Voltaire, illusion. To others, it is a laboratory of the mind, a testing ground for politics and philosophy. It does not matter that the land itself is unseen, unfound, perhaps unreal. Its very absence gives it power. Atlantis becomes a canvas onto which the Enlightenment paints its deepest questions. What is the nature of man? What is the destiny of civilization? Can reason save us, or will pride drown us once more? Outside the cities, beyond the philosophers' debates, explorers still sail. Reports arrive of distant islands in the Pacific, of ruins in the Americas, of cultures unknown to Europe until now. Each discovery feeds the imagination, blurring the lines between myth and fact. Some whisper, could these be fragments of Atlantis? The Enlightenment mind, even as it sharpens itself with skepticism, cannot quite let go of the dream. A new world glimmers just beyond reach, and in its glimmer, Plato's old story leaves again. The 18th century is an age of balance, poised between past and future. It reveres the ancients, yet dares to question them. It dreams of perfect societies, yet arms itself with reason against illusions. Atlantis, in this delicate balance, thrives as both memory and metaphor. It is at once lost and present, vanished yet endlessly revived in the human imagination. One might picture it like this: a candlelit room in Paris, the air heavy with smoke and thought. A philosopher speaks of man's natural goodness, another of his folly. Someone laughs, someone sighs. The conversation drifts toward lost golden ages, toward Plato's island. And though none in that room have seen it, though none can say if it ever was, all lean in to listen, because in the myth they hear themselves. They hear their hopes, their fears, their visions of what could be. Atlantis becomes a question more than an answer. What is it that humanity longs for when it tells this story again and again? Is it the ache of loss, the dream of perfection, the thrill of discovery, or is it something quieter? The recognition that all civilizations, no matter how radiant, are fragile, and that even as we reach for eternity, we are bound to time's deep tides. As the century advances, revolutions stir, old orders tremble, new ideas burn like stars. The Enlightenment's longings, so often dressed in myth, begin to shape real history. And in the background, Atlantis lingers, not as land, not as ruin, but as an enduring metaphor for humanity's restless search. The philosophers leave their salons, the candles burn low, and the night grows still. Yet the dream of Atlantis remains, flickering like an afterimage on the mind's horizon, ready to drift into new revolutions, new awakenings, and the storms of history yet to come. The 19th century is an age of echoes, an age when ruins are not just remnants, but invitations, whispers from the past that draw the living into reverie. The world, already reshaped by revolutions, by industrial smoke, and by restless change, looks backward with a curious kind of tenderness. The romantic soul searches for the sublime, for beauty that trembles at the edge of grief, and Atlantis, long forgotten by scholars, re-emerges as a dream, not a map, not a theory, but a vision painted in melancholy light. It is no longer Plato's island of moral lesson, nor Bacon's dream of reason perfected. It becomes something softer, sadder, and infinitely more human, a city that has slipped away, leaving only the ache of its absence. The Romantics did not seek Atlantis in soundings of the seafloor or in the archives of libraries. They sought it in the tides of feeling, in the vastness of the imagination, in the haunting silence of the deep. To understand why Atlantis blossomed again in this century, we must linger among the currents that stirred Europe. Empires stretched outward, technology roared forward, but hearts looked inward. Amid smokestacks and railways, poets yearned for lost Edens. The ruins of Rome were not only studied, but sketched at dusk, moss clinging to stone, the shadows of history falling long across broken columns. Painters let their brushstrokes tremble with light that seemed half dream, half memory. This was the soil in which Atlantis flourished, not as proof, but as poetry. The ocean itself was changing in the romantic imagination, no longer just a highway of trade or a frontier of conquest. It became a stage for longing. Writers such as Lord Byron and Percy Bysshe Shelley saw the sea as mirror and abyss, a place where the heart could dissolve into immensity. Waves became the language of sorrow, storms the cry of passion. And beneath these waters, how could there not be a city, vast and forgotten, a cathedral of memory drowned in silence? Atlantis was not a location. It was the soul, mirrored in salt and spray. Painters carried this vision further. One can almost see the canvases, moonlight casting a silver path across restless waters, ruins glowing faintly beneath translucent waves, women with wind-swept hair gazing seaward, waiting for something lost. Though few paintings dared to name Atlantis outright, the sensibility was everywhere. Caspar David Friedrich painted ruins and seascapes that, while German and earthly, carried the same unspoken ache, that sense that what is most beautiful is already slipping away. The drowned city was not on his canvas, but it was in his silence. The poets, too, wove Atlantis into their verses, sometimes naming it, sometimes only circling its absence. The romantic mind delights in the half-said, the hinted, the echo rather than the proclamation. Thus Atlantis often hovers as suggestion, the idea that beneath every horizon lies something more, something unreachable. In their verses, the ocean ceases to be mere geography, it becomes the subconscious of humanity itself, vast, dark, luminous with mystery. and what is buried in that subconscious, but longing for what is gone. Atlantis becomes not merely a myth of the sea, but the very shape of yearning. Why was Atlantis so irresistible to the Romantics? Perhaps because it was the perfect marriage of ruin and wonder. Unlike Troy, which could be unearthed, or Rome, whose stones still stood, Atlantis was untouchable. Its absence was its essence. The very impossibility of finding it allowed it to remain forever luminous, forever mourned. It became a mirror for the century's greatest desire to feel deeply, to ache beautifully, to touch eternity in sorrow. Consider the romantic fascination with drowning, not merely as death, but as metaphor. Water was imagined as embrace, as dissolution, as the boundary where self slips into infinity. To drown was to be swallowed into mystery, to vanish into depth. How naturally, then, Atlantis became a symbol of this surrender. It was not destroyed by fire or war, but by water. The element most suited to dream, to disappearance, to beauty tinged with pain. The city drowned, and in drowning, became eternal. Travelers of the 19th century often wrote of ruins half consumed by the sea, of ancient walls crumbling into waves, of harbours swallowed by shifting coasts. The sight of nature reclaiming stone seemed to affirm Atlantis without needing to name it. Every lost harbour became a reminder that civilizations are fragile, that time is patient, that the sea always waits. These ruins were not merely curiosities, they were emotional landscapes, places where a wanderer could stand and imagine whole cities gone. Even music carried this note. Composers began to weave the sea into their scores, storms in symphonies, calm waves in nocturnes, the hush of tides in operatic choruses. Though Atlantis was rarely sung directly, the atmosphere was unmistakable. Beneath every crashing crescendo lay the same truth that the sea hides both terror and beauty, both memory and oblivion. The romantic listener, eyes closed, could hear Atlantis in the undertow of melody, in the silence between notes. And so, Atlantis passed into the 19th century imagination as an emotional truth. It did not need proof. It did not ask to be measured by geologists or charted by explorers. It asked only to be felt, to be dreamed. The island became less a myth of history than a myth of the heart. It was the unattainable ideal, the shimmering what if, that no reality could match. Just as lovers of ruins stood in awe before broken arches, knowing they were most beautiful because they were broken, so too was Atlantis most beautiful because it was lost. This was the romantic gift to the myth. They taught us to love Atlantis, not for what it might reveal, but for what it could never give. They turned it into longing itself, into a story that would never find its ending, into an H that became strangely soothing. Like moonlight on waves, it was unreachable, yet unforgettable. And this romantic Atlantis would linger, carried forward not in footnotes, but in paintings, in poems, in sighs that rose with the tide. It set the stage for new transformations, some mystical, some dangerous, that would come in the century ahead. For myths like seas never stay still. They shift, they surge, they take new shapes. Atlantis, softened in poetry, would soon harden again in doctrine, in belief, in the bold claims of mystics who declared that they knew the truth. Atlantis, dressed in moonlight and sorrow, drifts across the romantic sea as poetry itself. Yet even as poets sigh and painters dream, a new current begins to stir. The voices of mystics and visionaries who claim the lost island not as longing, but as truth. The 19th century, with all its yearning and melancholy, hands Atlantis into new keeping. No longer only a sigh of poets, no longer only the shimmer of moonlit seas, the myth now finds itself clothed in revelation. The age of romantic longing begins to shade into the age of mystical certainties. What had once been dream becomes doctrine. What had once been a symbol becomes a supposed history of the soul itself. This transformation takes place in parlors and drawing rooms, among circles of seekers hungry for wisdom older than the world they know. Industrial smoke clouds the skies. Science redraws the cosmos. Darwin whispers of human origins that unsettle faith. In this moment of shifting foundations, many turn to mysteries, to esoteric traditions, to whispers of knowledge hidden beneath the currents of time. And Atlantis, ever ready to change its form, becomes the perfect vessel for this longing. At the center of this reawakening stands Yelena Petrovna Blavatsky, a Russian mystic and traveler whose writings would give Atlantis a new life. In 1888, her vast and labyrinthine work, The Secret Doctrine, weaves the lost island into a grand cosmic narrative. For Blavatsky, Atlantis is not merely Plato's parable. It is an epoch, a vanished chapter in the long, hidden story of humanity. She speaks of root races, vast stages of human evolution, of which the Atlanteans are one. In her vision, Atlantis becomes the cradle of a civilization older, wiser, and stranger than any remembered in history. To read her words is to enter a world where myth dissolves into metaphysics. She writes not of ships and maps, but of astral planes, of souls incarnating through cycles of time, of knowledge passed down from vanished ages. Atlantis, in her telling, is the lost home of a once great race whose wisdom was both vast and perilous. Its fall is not just a cautionary tale of pride, but a cosmic turning point, a step in the soul's long pilgrimage across eons. For many readers of the late 19th century, her vision is intoxicating. It gives Atlantis the weight of revelation. It makes the Lost Island not a dream of poets, but a key to understanding human destiny. Where scientists measured fossils and strata, she spoke of forgotten wisdom, buried not in stone but in spirit. Atlantis becomes less a place beneath the sea and more a memory buried in the soul of humankind. This occult Atlantis flourishes in the theosophical movement, spreading across continents. In London, in New York, in India, circles gather to read, to debate, to meditate. They imagine the Atlanteans as mighty beings, both noble and flawed, whose downfall came from the misuse of powers beyond comprehension. Some envision crystal technologies, others spiritual gifts lost to the ages. The sea that swallowed Atlantis is no longer a physical tide, but a veil of forgetfulness cast over humanity itself. Mystics and visionaries seize upon these ideas, expanding and reshaping them. For some, Atlantis becomes the birthplace of all ancient religions, the hidden root from which Egyptian temples, Vedic hymns, and Mayan pyramids all flow. For others, it is the lost continent of Lemuria's successor, a stage in an endless drama of creation and destruction. Always it is imagined as golden and luminous, a paradise undone by pride, yet still shimmering in the soul's memory. We might pause here, in quiet reflection, and see how far Atlantis has drifted from Plato's dialogue, where it served as a parable of virtue and corruption. It has become the cornerstone of an esoteric cosmology. From a myth told in words, it has become a memory believed in as truth. The romantic sea had given Atlantis its sorrowful beauty. Now the mystical current gives it authority, turning yearning into certainty, turning longing into revelation. Yet even in this transformation, something essential remains. Atlantis is still the story of loss, of fall, of a grandeur that slipped away. Theosophy simply extends that loss to cosmic proportions, turning it into the great cycle of all human becoming. The drowned city is no longer just stone beneath waves. It is humanity's forgotten self, the wisdom we once carried and must one day reclaim. As the 19th century yields to the 20th, Atlantis in the hands of mystics continues to shape imaginations. Writers draw upon Blavatsky's vision, elaborating upon the Atlanteans as a race of sages, builders of wonders beyond comprehension. Some describe great temples of crystal harnessing energies of the earth. Others speak of vast flying machines lost to time. Each retelling glows with the same conviction that Atlantis was real, that it holds a key to our destiny, that its memory stirs still in dreams and visions. The appeal lies not in archaeology, nor in philosophy, but in longing made certain. The occult Atlantis speaks to those who feel the modern world has lost its center, who sense that material progress cannot answer the hunger of the soul. To imagine a vanished golden age is to imagine that wisdom still exists, hidden and waiting, and that humanity is not wandering aimlessly but walking a long road back to forgotten light. Of course, the scholars of the age dismiss these claims. Historians shake their heads. Geologists laugh at talk of root races and vanished continents. Yet the myth proves immune to such rejection. It does not live by evidence. It lives by need. The need to believe that beneath the surface of history lies a deeper truth. That behind the shifting of empires there is a rhythm, a purpose, an eternal tide. And so, while libraries catalogue Plato and universities trace archaeology, the myth of Atlantis flows elsewhere, into seances, into spiritual lodges, into whispered lectures beneath dim lamps. It spreads into fiction, into esoteric journals, into dreams told over tea and candlelight. It is never still. It changes, adapts, grows, shimmering with secrets. When we stand back and look, we see that Atlantis, in this mystical age, becomes less about the sea than about the spirit. It becomes the soul's lost homeland, the place we all half remember and half long for. It is not an island beneath the waves, but the echo within us that insists there was once more, and that there may be again. The occult Atlantis is luminous, dangerous, and enduring. In it we glimpse the strange power of myths, not only to teach or to inspire, but to convince, to command, to reshape reality itself. For those who believed, Atlantis was not a metaphor. It was history, hidden and revealed, prophecy and promise, and even now its echoes linger in spiritual movements, in new myths born of old, in the endless human hunger for origins. Atlantis, shimmering in the hands of mystics, becomes less a city than a prophecy. Yet as seekers turn their eyes inward for hidden wisdom, another current begins to stir. The voices of science, cautious but curious, daring to ask if the tale might hide not spirit alone, but echoes of the earth itself. The tide shifts once more. The age of mystics and visionaries, who saw Atlantis shimmering in the astral plane, begins to recede. A new century, hungry for proof, stretches its hands into the waves. Science, with its tools of geology, archaeology, and history, turns its gaze seaward. What had once been parable, then poetry, then prophecy, is now treated as hypothesis. Could Plato's tale of a drowned island conceal a memory of real catastrophe? The 19th and 20th centuries are restless ages, brimming with invention. Steamships slice the oceans, railways stitch continents, telegraphs carry voices faster than wind. In this climate of discovery, The sea itself seems a frontier waiting to be measured, charted, explained. Where romantics gazed into waves for longing, scientists peer into them for evidence. And Atlantis, elusive and magnetic, becomes the question they cannot resist. The first to approach it with modern curiosity are historians, who sift Plato's dialogues for clues. In Timaeus and Critias, the philosopher tells of an island, larger than Libya and Asia combined, lying beyond the Pillars of Hercules, which is to say, beyond the Strait of Gibraltar. From this island, he says, a mighty people once threatened Athens, only to be defeated and drowned in a cataclysm. The story is precise in detail, yet dreamlike in scope. Could Plato have drawn from some older memory a tale of flood, of island swallowed by the sea? Geologists step in with their own questions. The earth, they know, bears scars of sudden violence. Volcanoes erupt and erase towns in a day. Earthquakes topple cities in minutes. Tsunamis sweep away whole coasts, leaving silence where harbors once bustled. If such devastation happens in the span of a human life, what must the deep record of the planet conceal? Suddenly, Atlantis does not seem impossible. The world has seen islands rise from the sea and others vanish beneath it. The story may be myth, yet it rhymes with nature's truths. Consider the island of Santorini, ancient Thera. Its crescent shape is the mark of one of the most catastrophic eruptions in human memory. Around 1600 BCE, fire tore the island apart, collapsing its center into the sea and sending walls of water across the Aegean. Whole settlements vanished, ash-darkened skies. In later centuries, sailors would gaze at the broken caldera and wonder at its story. Might Plato's tale have preserved some echo of such disaster? The question lingers, even as scholars debate dates, distances, details. The science of the sea deepens as new tools emerge. Soundings are taken to measure depths. Maps of the seafloor slowly take shape, revealing mountains, ridges, and chasms hidden beneath the waves. What had been imagined as uniform and flat is discovered to be as dramatic as any continent. Scientists marvel if valleys and peaks exist below. Might ruins also linger? Expeditions set out, scanning coastlines, probing harbors, listening to the silence of the deep. And yet, always, Atlantis slips away. For every hypothesis, there comes a counter-argument. If Plato spoke of an island beyond Gibraltar, could he have meant the Azores, lonely and storm-beaten in the mid-Atlantic? But those islands show no ruins, no drowned cities. If he described a land larger than Libya and Asia combined, was he exaggerating or mistranslating? Scholars argue over measurements, over the reliability of his sources. Some insist it was allegory, a moral fable disguised as history. Others cling to the hope that beneath the waves lies truth awaiting rediscovery. Archaeologists add their voices. They dig into Mediterranean shores, uncovering ruins swallowed by shifting sands or claimed by rising seas. They find evidence of floods, of sudden abandonments, of civilizations that thrived and then vanished. The Minoans of Crete, once radiant in art and commerce, fell into decline after the eruption of Thera and the quakes that followed. Could this have been the kernel of Plato's tale, an echo of a brilliant people undone by the violence of the earth? Each shard of pottery, each ruined wall, feels like a whisper from Atlantis, though no one can prove the link. Meanwhile, catastrophes of the present give haunting reminders. In 1883, Krakatoa erupts in the Dutch East Indies, shattering itself in explosions heard across oceans. Waves race outward, drowning coasts, sweeping away whole villages. Ash clouds blot the sun, and sunsets across the world glow with eerie crimson for years. Here is Atlantis in real time, not in myth, but in fire and water, in the cries of the living and the silence that follows. The world realizes that Plato's tale, whether historical or not, describes events that nature can and does deliver. As the 20th century advances, technology sharpens its gaze. Sonar maps the ocean floor. Submarines glide into depths once unreachable. Expeditions probe the Mediterranean, the Caribbean, the Atlantic, the Indian Ocean. Each trench and plateau is named, measured, catalogued. Scientists discover lost coastlines, drowned river valleys, evidence of sea levels rising after the last ice age. They find wrecks of ships, forests long buried, forgotten harbours. Yet no vast city emerges, no walls of stone, no avenues of marble, no Atlantis. Still, the search continues, not because scientists need the myth, but because humans do. The idea that Plato may have preserved a memory of disaster refuses to fade. Some suggest Atlantis is not one place, but many, an echo of countless floods remembered in countless tongues. Others insist it is a composite myth, a tale woven from fragments of real calamities. The myth remains unproven, but it proves something deeper, that humanity cannot resist the mystery of the sea. What science gives is not certainty, but perspective. It shows us the power of the earth, the fragility of civilizations, the truth that seas rise and fall, that islands appear and disappear, that the world we know rests on shifting ground. Atlantis, whether real or not, becomes a symbol of this instability. Science, in its careful way, confirms the possibility, even as it denies the proof. The ocean hides more than we may ever find. And so the scientists join the poets, though they do not mean to. The geologist who studies a drowned coastline, the archaeologist who brushes sand from a ruined harbour, the historian who traces myths of floods, all are, in their way, dreamers of Atlantis. They walk the thin line between memory and imagination, between fact and yearning. And though they speak in measurements and data, they too feel the pull of the lost island, shimmering at the edge of knowing. Perhaps that is why the myth endures even under science's gaze. For in measuring the sea, we confront not only the Earth's past, but our own fragility. We see how small our cities are before the tides, how brief our triumphs are before the patience of stone and water. Atlantis becomes the reminder that what is built can be undone, that what rises can fall, that nothing stands forever. And yet, there is beauty in this truth. Science does not diminish the myth, it deepens it. It teaches us that the earth itself is more mysterious than we imagined, that its history is written in fire and water, in tremors and tides. It tells us that behind every ruin is a story of resilience, that even drowned worlds leave traces in memory. Atlantis, measured but never found, becomes the meeting place of dream and knowledge, of yearning and discovery. So the scientists leave their charts, their maps, their soundings. The ocean remains vast, enigmatic, unreadable in full. Atlantis has not emerged from the deep, but it has taught us to look, to wonder, to listen. And in that listening, we are closer to the myth than ever before. Science dives into the waves and finds not Atlantis, but the memory of countless ruins and disasters. Yet from these fragments rises a new possibility, that perhaps one eruption, one island, one drowned civilization may have given Plato his tale. The whispers of Thera, the island of fire, begin to call. The Aegean Sea holds its breath. Its islands rise from the water like fragments of forgotten stories. their cliffs carved by wind and tide, their stones steeped in centuries of silence. And there, among them, lies Thera, modern Santorini, its crescent shape like a scar from a wound long healed, but never forgotten. It is a wound carved not by human hands, but by the fire of the earth itself. Nearly 3,600 years ago, the island convulsed. Beneath its calm blue waters, magma rose with relentless pressure until the mountain could no longer contain it. What followed was an eruption of unthinkable violence, one of the largest in human memory. The heart of Thera was torn apart in a single cataclysm, its center collapsing into the sea, leaving behind a hollowed caldera where life had once thrived. Ash darkened the sky, falling upon distant lands. The sea heaved, walls of water racing outward, swallowing coastlines. For those who survived, the world must have seemed overturned, gods unmoored, the order of life itself unmade. It is here, in this island torn by fire and flood, that some believe we find the real breath of Plato's Atlantis. The Minoan civilization had flourished across the Aegean before the eruption. Centered on Crete, their palaces shimmered with frescoes of lilies, dolphins, and dancers in flowing skirts. Their cities were bright with artistry and trade, their harbours crowded with ships that stitched together a maritime empire. They were seafarers, merchants, and craftsmen who drew wealth from the currents of the Mediterranean. They left behind no epic armies and no tales of conquest, but traces of beauty, of elegance, of a people whose life seemed tuned to rhythms of the sea. Then came the eruption. The explosion of Thera was not a single event, but a cascade. First earthquakes, shaking walls and collapsing columns. Then the ash, thick and choking, covering fields, poisoning crops, burying homes. Finally, waves, tsunamis that rolled outward, slamming into the coasts of Crete and beyond. Entire harbours vanished, ships were flung onto land, and with them, a civilization was shaken to its core. Archaeologists have long wondered if this disaster struck at the heart of the Minoans' strength. Their palaces fell into ruin, their networks unraveled. Within a few generations, the bright power of Minoan Crete dimmed, overtaken by others who rose in the wake of their fall. What had seemed so secure, so flourishing, vanished into history's silence, leaving only ruins and painted fragments. It is easy, perhaps too easy, to imagine Plato's Atlantis in this story, a seafaring people, advanced for their age, wealthy, artistic, deeply tied to the ocean. A sudden disaster, fire and flood, the sea reclaiming what it had given. And then, the memory of a civilization that disappeared almost without explanation. The parallels are haunting, and they have drawn scholars and dreamers alike into the labyrinth of comparison. We walk now among the ruins of Knossos, Crite's great palace, trying to listen to echoes of that vanished world. The stones are sun-warmed, the corridors twisting, the stairways winding downward and upward as if chasing secrets. Frescoes of dolphins leap across the walls, painted in colours that time has not wholly stolen. Women in flowing garments raise their arms in ritual, acrobats vault over bulls, flowers bloom in endless spring. This is no stern, warlike society carved in bronze. It is something softer, stranger, more luminous. It feels almost like a dream, a city half remembered from sleep. And yet, as we look, we cannot help but see Atlantis glimmering behind it. Plato's tale of a land of beauty and power swallowed by the sea. The Minoans' frescoes whisper of harmony with nature, yet their sudden fall whispers of catastrophe. To scholars, the Santorini eruption offers a bridge, myth and geology meeting across time. Perhaps Plato, writing centuries later, heard faint echoes of this disaster carried in stories, passed down from sailor to sailor, from shore to shore. Perhaps what he shaped into allegory was rooted in the trauma of real people who watched the sea rise and their homes vanish, and yet doubts remain. Plato describes Atlantis as vast, a continent beyond the Pillars of Hercules. Crete and Thera are small by comparison. The timelines do not perfectly match, the geography does not align. Plato's tale is woven with the textures of philosophy, not geology. Still, the Santorini theory endures, not as a solution, but as a haunting possibility. Standing at the cliffside of modern Santorini, looking into the deep blue of the caldera, it is easy to imagine. The sea fills what was once land. Villages of white and blue cling to the edges, their beauty shadowed by the knowledge of what lies beneath. The volcano still breathes, quiet but restless, a reminder that the earth does not forget. Tourists sip wine above the caldera's rim, their laughter drifting on the wind as boats trace circles over waters that once boiled with fire. Beneath them lie the buried towns of Akrotiri, frozen in ash like Pompeii, streets, houses, and pottery sealed by disaster, their voices silenced but not lost. Here, in these ruins, we walk with both history and myth. We touch the walls painted with swallows and spirals, and we feel that we are not just visitors in a museum but wanderers in a dream. Atlantis hovers, shimmering, not as certainty, but as metaphor. The Santorini theory reminds us that myths are rarely born from nothing. They sprout from memories, from fragments of truth carried forward, reshaped by the needs of storytellers and listeners. Perhaps Atlantis was never meant to be found on a map. Perhaps it is an echo of the Minoans, their light extinguished by fire and wave. Or perhaps it is all coincidence, a reflection cast by human longing to give shape to the unknown. Still, Santorini offers a vision so vivid that it lingers. To stand here is to feel both the power of nature and the fragility of civilization. To see how quickly beauty can vanish, how easily the sea can reclaim its own. The Santorini theory does not solve the riddle of Atlantis. Instead, it deepens it, layering myth upon memory, history upon dream. The volcano sleeps now, but the sea remembers. The caldera is a mirror, and when we look into it, we glimpse not only the shadow of a lost civilization, but also the human need to tell stories that give meaning to disaster. We leave Santorini with its sunsets and whitewashed houses, but also with its silence. Beneath the beauty, beneath the holiday laughter, lies an old wound. And like all wounds, it carries memory. A memory that might have drifted into Plato's words, reshaped into a story that still refuses to die. As the caldera darkens beneath the evening sky, we turn from Santorini and its ancient wound, carrying the question forward: if the sea can so easily erase, what other traces of Atlantis might lie hidden still, waiting for the gaze of explorers who search the seabed of memory. The 20th century opens like a trembling dawn, a new age, restless and unsteady. Nations rise with banners held high, each proclaiming destiny, each insisting on its place in the sun. In this charged atmosphere of pride and rivalry, old stories are no longer simply stories. They are called upon as weapons, draped in flags, sharpened into proof of superiority. Even Atlantis, once a shimmering parable in Plato's dialogues, finds itself conscripted into the battles of identity. The myth, fragile as mist, is hardened into iron. For centuries, Atlantis had been a dream of philosophers, poets, explorers. It had lived in the pages of Plato, in the reveries of Bacon, in the longings of romantics and the speculations of scientists. But in the political storms of the 20th century, the myth was pulled downward, pressed into the soil of blood and nation. No longer a dream of lost wisdom, it became, in the hands of some, a claim of birthright. A vanished homeland was imagined as proof of ancient superiority, a cradle from which chosen peoples might trace their lineage. In Germany, whispers of Atlantis grew into proclamations. Writers of the late 19th century had already woven tales of a northern Atlantis, a lost continent that gave rise to a pure and noble race. By the time the Nazis marched into power, this idea became dangerously useful. Atlantis, once a parable of pride punished, was remade as a justification for pride itself. The myth was rewritten into the narrative of Aryan origins, a tale in which a sunken continent became the lost Eden of a master race. Plato's warning of hubris twisted into a rallying cry for domination. We must pause here, quietly, and notice the irony. In Plato's telling, Atlantis falls because it succumbs to arrogance and greed, because it forgets the balance between power and virtue. Yet in the 20th century, the same story was claimed to exalt arrogance, to sanctify conquest. The moral was inverted, the caution erased. A myth that once stood as a mirror of human failure was transformed into an anthem for supremacy. It was not only Germany that sought Atlantis for national dreams. Across Europe and beyond, nations in search of ancient legitimacy cast their nets into the seas of myth. Spain, once the launching point of Columbus, nurtured its own connection to the story. Some claimed that Atlantis was the forerunner of Iberian civilization, a sunken root feeding the grandeur of empire. In Britain, too, the myth was considered an island nation imagining kinship with another lost island of power. For imperial nations that spanned oceans, Atlantis was a convenient echo proof, perhaps, that their maritime destiny had been written in the depths of time. Beyond Europe, Atlantis also traveled into the Americas, where identity was still being shaped from the fragments of conquest and migration. Some suggested that the indigenous peoples of the New World were descendants of Atlanteans, a narrative that both exoticized and diminished them, stripping away their own histories in favor of a myth imported from Europe. Others, particularly in the United States, leaned on the story to imagine a spiritual prehistory for their own nation. A sense that the New World had ancient, mystical roots beneath its soil. Atlantis, in these tellings, became a way of belonging to a deeper time, of claiming continuity with a grandeur that no one could verify, but everyone could imagine. We might wonder why the 20th century, of all centuries, twisted Atlantis so tightly into politics. The answer lies partly in the anxieties of modernity. As machines roared, as cities grew vast, as wars shattered old orders, nations clutched at stories that promised ancient legitimacy. Myths became anchors in uncertain seas. Atlantis, with its aura of mystery and its hints of greatness lost, was irresistible. It could be claimed, reshaped, and wielded as proof of destiny. In a century that saw world wars and collapsing empires, the myth offered a way to look backward for validation while stepping forward with aggression. But such uses came at a cost. In the hands of ideologues, Atlantis lost its tenderness, its poetry, its haunting ambiguity. It became brittle, a tool of propaganda. Where once the story had invited reflection on hubris, it now demanded obedience to pride. Where once it whispered of the fragility of civilizations, it now thundered as evidence of superiority. The myth was no longer a gentle tide, but a weapon forged of salt and steel. And yet, myths resist full capture. Even as politicians and propagandists twisted Atlantis into ideology, others continued to find in it something softer, something untamed. Novelists, artists, and dreamers of the same century painted Atlantis not as proof of power, but as a symbol of loss, of yearning, of the fragility of memory. They reminded us that myths cannot be wholly contained by those who would control them. Like the sea itself, Atlantis slips through fingers that try to grasp too tightly. Still, we cannot ignore the darker chapter. The myth of Atlantis was present in speeches, in pseudo-scientific writings, in racial theories that justified exclusion and violence. It became tangled with the language of eugenics, with the rhetoric of empire, and so, in the shadowed years of war, a city that never existed contributed, however faintly, to the suffering of those who did. It is sobering to realize that even a dream of a lost island can leave real scars when wielded without care. When the wars ended and the rubble of cities smoldered, Atlantis lingered. Chastened, perhaps, but not silenced. Scholars distanced the tale from the ideologies that had abused it, returning it to questions of archaeology and geology. Writers once more imagined it in poetry and fantasy. The myth emerged again like a ruined ship resurfacing after the storm. But the memory of its political use remained, a reminder of how even the gentlest of stories can be weaponized when pride and fear take hold. In the long rhythm of history, Atlantis has been many things. A parable, a dream, a vision, a warning. In the 20th century, it revealed its shadow, how longing for origins can curdle into obsession, how the hunger for identity can twist myth into doctrine. The sea, which holds so many wrecks, also holds this truth that stories, once loosed into the world, can be turned toward light or darkness. And so we leave this century of nationalisms and lost empires with a heavy awareness. Atlantis is no longer only a philosopher's parable. It has been used to justify conquest, to sanctify supremacy, to reshape memory. But it has also endured beyond those uses, surviving in song and dream, refusing to belong to any single claim. The myth drifts free once more, waiting to be reimagined in gentler hands. As the 20th century closes, Atlantis rises again from propaganda into possibility, slipping from the grasp of nations back into the waters of imagination. And there, in the quiet between wars and discoveries, it waits, ready to be reborn in culture, in novels, in films. The sea has always spoken in whispers, but in the modern age, it begins to sing in brighter colours. Projected onto pages, screens and stages, Atlantis, once the philosopher's fable and later the weapon of empires, drifts now into the wide tide of popular culture. The 20th century, restless and inventive, cannot resist the pull of the drowned city. It takes the myth into its hands like clay, reshaping it again and again, until it becomes not one story, but 1,000. In novels, Atlantis comes alive with vivid detail. Writers breathe into its streets paved with coral, palaces lit by crystal lamps, gardens that sway beneath the waves. Each author becomes an architect of their own Atlantis, designing a city that no diver has ever found. Yet that readers can walk through in their minds, from the adventure tales of the early century to the sprawling fantasy epics of the later decades. Atlantis is never far from the imagination of storytellers. It serves as a stage upon which humanity rehearses its deepest hopes, a place of wisdom, of beauty, of power lost and perhaps recoverable. And then there is Jules Verne, though writing already in the 19th century, whose vision flows into the new century with undimmed light. His 20,000 Leagues Under the Seas places Captain Nemo before the ruins of Atlantis, a scene that glows like a lantern in the imagination of generations. Verne does not simply describe a lost city. He makes us wander its silent avenues, feel the weight of its forgotten grandeur. This moment in literature becomes a seed that sprouts across the 20th century, inspiring writers and readers alike to dream of their own encounters with the vanished world beneath the sea. Cinema soon follows, bringing Atlantis from the page to the flickering screen. In the darkened theatres of the 1920s and 1930s, audiences watch silent films that imagine grand temples crumbling into the ocean or civilizations drowned by sudden cataclysm. Later, the golden age of Hollywood and the bloom of animation give Atlantis shimmering new forms. Some films show it as a city of decadence punished, others as a hidden kingdom still alive beneath the waves, waiting to be discovered by bold explorers. Always, it is bathed in mystery, a light that flickers just beyond reach. Children grow up with these images, carrying them into their play. Comic books give Atlantis new heroes and villains. In the world of superheroes, Atlantis often survives as a kingdom beneath the sea, ruled by figures both noble and troubled. Here the myth becomes less about a lost past and more about an alternate present, a secret realm existing alongside our own. The sea is no longer only a graveyard of ruins, but a place where entire societies thrive, unseen yet vibrant. Music, too, finds its way into Atlantis. Songs rise and fall with its name, sometimes melancholy, sometimes triumphant. Lyrics speak of lost love and forgotten paradise, of cities swallowed by the tide, and of dreams shimmering beneath the waves. The rhythm of the ocean becomes the rhythm of longing, and Atlantis becomes a metaphor not just for place, but for emotion, for everything beautiful and unreachable, for everything that slips away before it can be held. Television, in the second half of the century, spins Atlantis into countless variations. It appears in science fiction, in documentaries, in children's cartoons. Each medium reshapes it with its own colors. Sometimes it is a cautionary tale of technological hubris. Sometimes it is a utopia of knowledge, sometimes a battlefield of cosmic forces. No matter the shape, it retains its essence. A city not quite real, yet too vivid to dismiss. What makes Atlantis so fertile in popular imagination? Perhaps it is the balance it holds between clarity and vagueness. Plato gave it just enough detail. An island, a mighty empire, a fall to ignite the mind, and left enough unsaid that anyone can fill the silence with their own visions. It is a canvas of absence, inviting endless painting. Each age, each artist, each child with a pencil in hand can sketch their own Atlantis. And, because it has never been found, it can never be disproved, never reduced to a single form. This freedom allows the myth to serve as a mirror. To some, Atlantis is a dream of perfect harmony, a paradise lost but remembered. To others, it is a warning of excess, a reminder that even the greatest civilizations can crumble. To children, it is simply a place of wonder, a glowing kingdom beneath the sea where mermaids and submarines meet. Each retelling, each adaptation reveals less about Atlantis itself and more about the hearts that imagine it. As the century progresses, the technology of imagination deepens. Radio broadcasts carry tales of Atlantis into homes, comic strips slip it into daily papers, video games at the century's close let players walk its halls, solve its puzzles. fight its imagined guardians. The myth no longer belongs only to philosophers, scholars, or poets. It belongs to everyone. To the child with a comic book, to the dreamer in the theatre, to the listener of a song played on a crackling radio. Atlantis has become common property, a jewel that shines differently depending on how it is held. Yet even as it spreads wide, the myth does not lose its haunting edge. Every glowing city beneath the waves carries within it the shadow of loss. Every kingdom thriving in secret is also a kingdom that once fell. Even in the bright lights of cinema and the bold ink of comics, there lingers a question: why do we keep dreaming of something that never was? Perhaps because we sense, in our bones, that every paradise is fragile, that every city, no matter how grand, can be undone by tides of time. Atlantis in popular imagination is no longer a warning preserved by philosophers, nor a weapon claimed by ideologues. It is something gentler, more playful, more expansive. It has become a stage upon which we rehearse our longings and fears, a mirror we carry into every new medium we invent. From the silent film to the glowing screen of a child's handheld device, Atlantis endures, not as a place we expect to find, but as a dream we expect to keep. And so, Atlantis drifts from the hands of rulers into the hands of dreamers, no longer bound to politics, but set free in culture. Yet beneath the bright stories and playful visions lies another silence. The silence of the sea itself, waiting with secrets untouched. The ocean is a patient keeper of secrets. For centuries, its vastness has been more imagined than known, a horizon of mystery where dreams like Atlantis could rest unchallenged. But the 20th century brings with it new tools, new eyes with which to look into the abyss. Sonar pulses echo through the waters, mapping ridges and trenches that no diver could reach. Satellites trace the contours of entire ocean basins, painting the once invisible in shades of relief. The age of exploration shifts from sails above to signals below. And yet, in all this searching, in all this technological peering, the silence of the sea remains. No lost continent rises from the depths. No marble colonnades gleam beneath the waves. Atlantis, if ever it was, does not appear on the screens of sonar operators or the charts of oceanographers. The myth lingers, but it lingers as longing, not as proof. The mid-20th century marks the dawn of deep-sea mapping on a grand scale. Scientists aboard research vessels send sound into the depths, listening for its return, tracing the hidden mountain chains of the ocean floor. What they discover is astonishing. The mid-Atlantic ridge, stretching like a spine across the seabed, trenches plunging deeper than Everest is tall, volcanic plains where magma seeps and cools in eternal night. It is a landscape vaster and stranger than any imagined kingdom, and it lies beneath the very waters once thought to conceal Atlantis. How poetic, then, that the search for one imagined world reveals 1,000 real ones. Instead of temples and statues, we find black smokers belching minerals into the sea. Instead of lost empires, we find ecosystems that thrive without sunlight, creatures glowing with their own luminescence in darkness eternal. The silence of Atlantis opens into a chorus of other wonders, reminding us that the sea does not need myth to be miraculous. Still, the human heart returns to its questions. Each new discovery is weighed against the old story. Could this ridge, this plateau, this drowned volcanic island be the trace of Plato's tale? Some point to the Azores, where volcanic peaks break the surface of the Atlantic. Others to the Caribbean, where submerged shelves whisper of ancient lands swallowed by rising seas. Each candidate rises briefly into speculation before subsiding again into the deep, unconfirmed, unresolved. Atlantis remains elusive even as the maps grow sharper. The silence of the ocean floor is not empty. It is filled with echoes of history, not of Atlantis, but of us. Sonar scans reveal shipwrecks resting in shadow vessels of war, of commerce, of migration. Each wreck is its own Atlantis, a city of human leaves stilled in an instant. Now claimed by coral and fish, these underwater graveyards speak of our journeys, our risks, our losses. They remind us that the sea has always been both passage and peril, both giver and taker of dreams. And there are other revelations, quieter but no less profound. Coral reefs sprawling like underwater forests, fragile and radiant. Ancient coastlines now drowned, revealing that the sea has never been fixed, that it advances and retreats over millennia. In the Mediterranean, scientists trace shorelines of a vanished world before the last ice age ended, when seas were lower and land stretched farther. These finds do not prove Atlantis, but they do remind us of the truth beneath the myth. Civilizations can indeed be erased by the rising tide, leaving only memory and ruin behind. The silence, then, is a paradox. It denies Atlantis, but affirms its essence. For while no sonar beam has yet revealed a sunken empire, the ocean shows us again and again how fragile the line is between presence and absence, between land and sea. Every drowned coastline, every forgotten wreck, every coral-covered ruin echoes the same truth Plato sought to tell, that what is built can be lost, that what stands above the waves today may sleep beneath them tomorrow. Modern explorers, unlike the seekers of old, often speak with humility. They do not promise Atlantis, they promise only to look, to listen, to measure. And in their patient work, there is a kind of reverence, not for the myth, but for the ocean itself. In their charts and scans, in their quiet watches on night seas, we glimpse a different kind of story, not of a single city lost, but of an entire planet whose depths remain vast, mysterious, and alive. Yet even with this humility, the dream persists. Museums hold exhibits titled with Atlantis, books continue to be written, documentaries still lean into the possibility. The silence is never final, never absolute. It hums with what-ifs, with the H of a story too enduring to be dismissed. Perhaps this is why the absence feels almost like presence, because the myth leaves most strongly where it cannot be proven or denied. There is a quiet beauty in this. The sea keeps its secrets, and in that keeping, it preserves our longing. If Atlantis were mapped tomorrow, if its streets were laid bare on a sonar scan, would it still haunt us so deeply? Or is it precisely because it remains hidden, precisely because the silence endures, that Atlantis continues to glow in imagination? The unknown, after all, is the most fertile ground for wonder. And so, as the 20th century's science deepens and the maps grow more intricate, Atlantis continues to elude capture. Instead, we find other treasures, shipwrecks like frozen time, ecosystems like living jewels, drowned coastlines whispering of ancient worlds. The sea does not give us the city we long for, but it gives us back something else, a reminder of our own smallness, our own yearning, our own place in the great ebb and flow of time. And still, in the hush of the sonar and the glow of the screens, the question lingers, why does the absence itself hold such power? Perhaps it is because in the silence, we begin to hear not the sea, but ourselves. A meditation that leads us into the next reflection. where myth becomes mirror. The sea is quiet tonight. Waves move like breath in sleep, slow and measured, touching the sand, and then retreating into silence. In that rhythm, we might ask, why has Atlantis lived so long in us? Why has it outlasted kingdoms and wars? Why has it lingered when whole empires have been forgotten? Perhaps it is because Atlantis, more than a story of a city lost, is a story of ourselves. Every myth is a mirror, and Atlantis, with its broken towers and drowned streets, reflects not only a past we cannot reach, but a future we fear. It is the shadow of human pride and the echo of our longing. When Plato first spoke of it, his listeners were not meant to be caught in the geography of the tale. They were meant to be caught in the lesson. A civilization that rose too high, reaching with ambition only to fall into the sea. But the human heart does not hold lessons neatly. It does not file them away as abstract warnings. Instead, it dreams them into symbols. It remakes them into longing. Atlantis endures because it allows us to imagine not only failure, but the possibility that something greater once existed, a wisdom we have forgotten, a harmony we have lost. It whispers, what if there was once a golden age, when knowledge and beauty were joined, when humanity walked with the gods, and when the world was whole? In this way, Atlantis is not just a ruin beneath the water. It is a lantern we keep lighting in the dark. It speaks both to our regret and to our hope. Consider the centuries of voices who have carried it forward. Philosophers treated it as allegory, but mystics treated it as truth. Explorers saw it as a prize to be found, while poets saw it as a metaphor for all that slips from us in time. Each age shaped Atlantis to its own reflection. In the Renaissance, it became a memory of wisdom older than Greece. In the age of exploration, it became a missing continent, proof that the maps of the world were still incomplete. In the 19th and 20th centuries, it was bent toward politics, science, nationalism. But beneath every reinvention there remained the same core ache that humanity once knew more than it does now, and that the knowledge was drowned. We live with this ache because loss is our most constant teacher. Every family knows it, every nation knows it, every generation watches something pass away. The myth of Atlantis magnifies that universal truth into a cosmic parable. Not only people are lost, not only traditions, but entire worlds. And so, Atlantis is never really about Atlantis. It is about us. When we speak of it, we speak of our fear that nothing lasts and of our desperate wish that something might. Think of the way it is drawn in art and literature. Sometimes Atlantis is rendered in shining white stone, its towers like marble flames rising from the sea as if memory itself could be rebuilt. Sometimes it is shown in fragments, broken arches covered in coral, stairs leading into nothingness. Both versions reveal who we are. In the shining city, we see our longing for perfection, our yearning for a paradise where justice and beauty were not at odds. In the broken ruins, we see our acceptance of time, our sorrow for all that falls apart. Atlantis, then, is not a myth of geography. It is a myth of the soul. When modern thinkers reflect on it, they often point out how easily we graft our desires onto the legend. If we crave wisdom, Atlantis becomes a library. If we crave power, Atlantis becomes a fortress. If we crave wonder, Atlantis becomes a glowing kingdom beneath the sea, waiting to be rediscovered. It is endlessly adaptable because it has no fixed shape. It is water itself, flowing into whatever vessel we place before it. But perhaps its deepest endurance comes from another truth. Atlantis is a mirror of mortality. We, too, are fleeting. We rise, we build, we imagine ourselves permanent, and then we are carried into the silence. Civilizations are only the larger mirrors of individual lives. Plato's drowned city is not only Athens reflected, or Carthage, or Rome. It is the reflection of a single human life, from birth's bright beginning to the slow, inevitable sinking into memory. In this way, each of us carries Atlantis within. Each of us fears the sea that will one day claim what we have built. And yet, there is tenderness here. For though Atlantis sinks, it is never forgotten. Perhaps this is the truest meaning of the myth. Destruction is not the final word. Memory is stronger. Longing is stronger. We speak of Atlantis not because it survived, but because it did not. In its absence, it becomes presence. In its silence, it becomes voice. Is this not what gives myths their power? Not that they are factual, but that they allow us to keep speaking about what we cannot hold. Atlantis is a memory that was never ours, and yet we cradle it as if it were. Even science, with its sonar maps and its careful measurements, cannot truly quiet the myth. The deep sea yields wrecks, trenches, coral kingdoms, but never Atlantis, and still we imagine it. Still, we long for it, because in truth we do not seek an island. We seek reassurance that what is lost may not be entirely gone. Perhaps this is why children love the story most of all. They picture the glowing domes beneath the waves, the mermaids who wander its halls, the libraries filled with forgotten knowledge. They imagine submarines touching down on lost streets, divers brushing silt away from statues. Children carry what we, as adults, sometimes bury: the ability to believe in what is not there, the openness to wonder. And so, Atlantis remains alive, because imagination is as powerful as history. To reflect on Atlantis is to reflect on ourselves, our pride, our grief, our hope. It is to admit that myths are not just stories we tell, but stories that tell us. They remind us of what we fear and what we desire, often more honestly than facts do. The enduring power of Atlantis lies in this: it allows us to speak of what cannot be spoken directly. The end of civilizations, the age of memory, the dream of perfection, the inevitability of loss. We look into the mirror of the myth, and we see our own faces in the reflection. And as long as humanity dreams, Atlantis will not drown. It will rise again in poems and novels, in films and whispers, in the quiet of the night, when someone looks out over the sea and wonders what lies beneath. For myths never die. They live where history cannot reach, in the chamber of the human heart. And so, in Atlantis, we glimpse ourselves, fragile, yearning, unfinished. In the next turning of history's page, we follow how this reflection becomes a compass, guiding seekers, dreamers, and wanderers still searching for the world that is always just out of reach. The sea is patient. It holds secrets not only in its depths but also in its silences. Waves rise, crash, and fade, carrying with them fragments of memory, but never the whole. For more than 2,000 years, humanity has bent its ear to the ocean, listening for a city that refuses to speak. Atlantis, the island that vanishes as soon as we approach it, exists most powerfully in its absence. Think of how often we return to it, not because anyone has touched its gates or walked its avenues, but precisely because no one has. The myth breathes in that emptiness, in the echo of possibility. In truth, it is the silence that sustains it. Had explorers one day raised its marble columns from the seabed, brushing off barnacles and seaweed. The mystery might have ended there, fossilized into archaeology. Instead, the unanswered question lingers, a whisper that resists closure. Absence has its own gravity. It draws imagination the way a black hole pulls light. The very fact that Atlantis is nowhere makes it everywhere. Every coastline becomes suspect, every ruin carries a shadow, every drowned land recalls its name. The myth teaches us something fundamental about longing, that sometimes it is the unattainable which most deeply shapes us. Plato, in his dialogues, framed the story as moral lesson, not as geography. And yet, over centuries, seekers stretched maps and bent compasses to make space for the city that was never meant to be found. With every expedition, with every speculation, the silence only grew more fertile. It is a paradox of history. The absence of Atlantis became more enduring than the presence of any city that truly stood. Consider how ruins affect us. Stand before the broken walls of Babylon or the shattered stones of Troy, and you encounter history grounded in earth. They are real, tangible, finite. You can trace the outlines of streets, touch the chisel marks left by forgotten hands. But Atlantis resists this. It offers no stone to hold, no wall to lean upon. Its absence means it can never decay. Paradoxically, it becomes the most perfect ruin because it is ruin without evidence, an eternal longing unspoiled by certainty. In this way, Atlantis mirrors the deepest hungers of the human heart. We are drawn not just to what is, but to what might have been. The lover longs for the unspoken word, the poet for the unwritten line, the dreamer for the unreachable shore. Atlantis is the geography of yearning itself. We inhabit it not with our bodies, but with our desires. Writers, painters, and dreamers throughout the centuries have leaned into this emptiness. They fill it with domes of crystal, temples of shining marble, streets lit by impossible suns beneath the sea. Each vision contradicts the next, yet all are nourished by the same well, the refusal of reality to pin Atlantis down. That refusal becomes freedom. Even science, which prides itself on precision, has been unable to seal the silence. Theories rise like waves. Santorini, Crete, the Caribbean, Antarctica, only to collapse again into the sea of speculation. Each new hypothesis is less important than the persistence of the question itself. For the moment Atlantis is proven, the dream dissolves. We might ask, then is the absence of Atlantis a kind of gift? Perhaps its power lies in what it withholds. To never be found means to always be sought. To exist only in imagination means to be endlessly reborn. The weight of absence is heavy, yes, but it is also luminous. It invites us to create, to wonder, to shape the unseen. This weight rests quietly across cultures, across ages. The fisherman staring at a calm horizon, the scholar turning fragile pages of Plato, the child sketching glowing domes beneath the ocean. All of them are joined in the same gesture, reaching for what cannot be grasped. Atlantis becomes less a city than a mirror. In its silence, we hear our own questions. In its absence, we sense our own incompleteness. The night sky, too, teaches us this lesson. We gaze at constellations, stitching patterns from scattered points of light, filling the void with stories. No one has ever walked the streets of Orion or leaned upon the walls of Cassiopeia, and yet we live with them as if they were neighbors. Atlantis belongs to this same realm, stars beneath the sea, guiding us not by presence, but by suggestion. And so the city grows heavier in our imagination with every century it is not found. Each unanswered generation adds another layer of mystery, Another tide of longing. What began as a parable in a philosopher's dialogue now weighs upon the cultural imagination like an immovable stone. But this stone is not in the seabed, it rests in the mind, immaterial yet impossible to ignore. Absence shapes us. It sharpens the contours of desire. It keeps us awake at night. It sends explorers into storms and poets into reverie. To speak of Atlantis is to speak of everything we have lost or fear to lose: wisdom, innocence, golden ages, homes washed away by time. Perhaps that is its truest meaning, not a lost city, but the symbol of all loss, and the beauty that emerges when memory refuses to let go. The weight of absence, then, is not despair. It is possibility. It is the invitation to dream beyond certainty, to honor silence as deeply as sound. For if Atlantis were found tomorrow, its story would end. But as long as it eludes us, it leaves. And so we drift in this paradox, letting the waves of imagination rise and fall, carrying with them a city never built in stone, but stronger than any ruin left upon the earth. Atlantis remains not by being discovered, but by remaining undiscoverable. Its absence is its immortality, and as we let the silence linger, we feel the tide shift again. For myths never end, they return. Atlantis, absent yet eternal, drifts toward its next rising. In the flow of memory and imagination, the tide gathers, leading us softly into the eternal return of the story. The tide moves in silence. It slips forward, retreats, and comes again, patient beyond the span of lifetimes. So it is with Atlantis. The city that never rests in the seabed rises, instead in the mind, cresting and falling with the ages, reshaping itself with every return. Plato's words are the first swell, the first pull of water. His dialogues set the rhythm. Yet from that beginning, the tide has never ceased. When the waves draw back, the city seems forgotten, left to slumber in obscurity. But inevitably, like the moon calling the sea, imagination beckons Atlantis to rise again. Every age remakes it. In the Renaissance, Atlantis surfaces in maps and sailors' tales, glittering with the promise of discovery. To explorers crossing uncharted waters, the myth becomes a companion, a compass pointing not north or south, but toward wonder. In the Enlightenment, it shifts once more, dressed in the language of reason, reimagined as an ancient society of wisdom and science. Later, in the Romantic Age, it glows with moonlight and sorrow, a city of longing rather than law. Always it changes, always it returns. This is the rhythm of the eternal tide, not permanence, but renewal. Atlantis is not one city, but countless reflections, each mirroring the heart of the time that dreams it. To speak of Atlantis is not to speak of marble or bronze, but of the endless human gesture of shaping the unseen. The myth does not stay still, for stillness is death. It lives by moving, by being carried, by flowing like water into each new shore of thought. Think of how a shoreline changes with every tide. Pebbles are rearranged, driftwood is left behind, shells glimmer in new places, and yet the sea itself remains. So too with Atlantis. The details shift. Domes of crystal in one century, golden temples in another, engines of impossible power in a third. Each version tells us less about the city itself and more about the dreamer standing at the edge of the sea. What does it mean that a myth survives by changing? Perhaps it reveals something about the nature of memory itself. Memory is not static, it is fluid, tidal. We retell the past not as it was, but as we need it to be. Atlantis, in this sense, is less a city than a mirror pool. Look into it, and you see not its ruins, but your own reflection. refracted through the shimmer of desire. For those who crave wisdom, Atlantis becomes a lost library, holding books the world has forgotten. For those who fear decline, it is a warning, a people punished for arrogance. For those who ache for beauty, it is a cathedral beneath the sea, radiant with coral light. The city bends and bends again, carrying each yearning like a wave upon its surface. It is tempting to think of myths as fragile, vulnerable to reason's sharp edge. But Atlantis proves otherwise. It has survived because it is fluid, because it does not demand one truth. Stone crumbles, but water endures. The tide erodes certainty, reshapes coastlines, and still returns. In the same way, Atlantis cannot be destroyed by skepticism, by science, or by silence. It transforms, and in transforming, it remains. Even today, in an age of satellites and sonar, the tide has not receded. Atlantis surges in novels, films, games, and dreams. Children draw glowing domes beneath the ocean, artists paint luminous ruins, and scientists still trace echoes of ancient floods across the seabed. The city may never be found, but it is never lost. Perhaps that is its greatest lesson, that what is most enduring in human culture is not certainty, but recurrence. Myths do not persist because they are proven. They persist because they return again and again with the tide of human imagination. Atlantis is eternal, not in stone, but in rhythm. The tide is also a kind of comfort. It assures us that what vanishes will one day return, even if changed. In Atlantis, we glimpse our own cycles of loss and renewal. Civilizations rise, flourish, and fall into silence. Yet something remains, carried forward like the sea carrying shells to a new shore. The eternal tide whispers that nothing is ever wholly gone. And so, as night deepens and silence gathers, we stand at the edge of this mythic sea. We watch the waves fold and unfold, each one carrying fragments of the city, a tower here, a memory there, a glow of possibility just beyond reach. We know the tide will retreat, taking Atlantis with it, but we also know it will come again and again and again. There is a peculiar peace in this endless return. For what is Atlantis, if not the embodiment of longing itself, a longing that never dies, but only changes shape? The city survives not because we find it, but because we keep seeking, and in that seeking, we reveal who we are, creatures of memory, of hope, of tides that move not only in the ocean, but in the soul. The eternal tide moves quietly, without haste, without end. Atlantis rises and falls upon it, never anchored, never lost. And as we let the image of the city drift once more beneath the waves, we recognize that it is not gone. It is waiting, as it always has, to return with the next tide of thought, the next dreamer, the next age of longing. The waves fall silent now, carrying Atlantis back into the deep. Yet we know the tide will return, and as the story ebbs away, we step into our own silence, holding the question that lingers beyond all myths: what shore within us waits for its own rising? And so Atlantis drifts away once more, as it always has, slipping beyond the horizon of certainty, leaving only the shimmer of memory in its wake. A city never seen, yet forever remembered. Its stones lie not in the ocean's floor, but within the tides of human thought. Tonight, we have not found ruins, nor raised temples from the deep, but something quieter, a reminder that what endures most is not always what can be touched, but what can be dreamed. The echo of Atlantis is the echo of our own longing, for wisdom, for golden ages, for worlds we can almost see in the half-light of imagination. And though centuries have passed, Though the sea has carried away 1,000 ships and swallowed 1,000 coasts, this story still hums in the quiet, like a candle that never truly goes out. Thank you for sharing this quiet hour with me. Thank you for listening, for allowing yourself to drift with me through this gentle corridor of time. In your presence here, the story finds its home. You are not only a listener, you are a keeper of the echo, part of the chain that carries myths forward, from voice to voice, from night to night. Now let the story rest. Let the waves that once carried Atlantis now carry you. Release the weight of the day. Soften the mind and step into stillness. May your dreams be wide as oceans, and may they carry you gently into morning light. This has been the Sleeping Hourglass, where the past tucks you in and where each story leaves a trace of wonder behind. If this brought you peace, you are always welcome to return whenever you need another candlelit hour with history. And now, let the tide ebb, let the candle dim, let sleep come.